Welcome to Citizen AYNE, the podcast where the industries of sport and media intersect. Never before has it been so necessary to understand this symbiotic partnership as the entire content and entertainment sectors disrupt at pace, led by ever more ambitious moguls. The reference to the Orson Welles masterpiece is therefore no coincidence. The show is brought to you by our friends at 54, themselves at the forefront of change in so many sport formats and models. 54 brings a unique and proven capability to align capital, strategy and execution capabilities for investors, most recently in golf, polo and padel. 54 and Citizen AYNE, the perfect match.
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of. You know, Mr. Bernstein, if I hadn't been very rich, I might have been a really great man.
Don't you think you are?
I think I did pretty well under the circumstances.
I'm Roger Mitchell, and this is Citizen AYNE, the sport and media podcast inspired by Orson Welles, Charles Kane, and moguls of that ilk. And I'm here again today with my co-host, the man himself, the wonderful friend and colleague, Mark Oliver. How are you, Mark?
I'm great, Roger. Thank you. I'm writing here in the quiet of Somerset.
Writing what?
Expert testimony on something I can't talk about.
Okay. Expert testimony. Well, that's a good validation for the podcast. Mark, I'm going to pass over to you straight away to tell everybody who we've got on the show today and why that is such an amazing piece of luck.
Well, we have Peter Hutton with us today, a man who's actually worked, I think, for three moguls, Murdoch, Zaslav and Zuckerberg, and who seems to have more current advisory and non-exec roles from golf clubs and the regulation golf bag at the moment. Everything from rugby league to professional triathletes to sports tech companies, Saudi Pro League, venture capitalists. Hello, Peter.
Hi, good to be with both of you.
Lovely to see you, Peter. Lovely to see you.
I'm sure we'll be asking you a lot about your numerous roles at the moment, away from big media, on the other side, so to speak. But first, a bit of history between us and the question. You may not remember, but we first met when you just joined Eurosport as CEO and following Discovery's takeover of that company and their acquisition of the European Olympic rights, both of which my company O&O had advised on. A starter question for you. Does or did Zaslav ever get sport, do you think?
Yeah, I think he does. And he's certainly a huge sports fan, which definitely helped. You know, you could see him light up when he went to the French Open. You could see him light up around the Olympics. And that definitely makes life easier. You know, if you're working with people that understand how much people care about sport, it makes for an easier relationship. And I think he got it, and I think John Malone got it. And, you know, there was lots of positives from that period that I still see as positives.
And does the Eurosport model, on reflection now, a few years on, do you think that works anymore, or have they upgraded it enough?
I think every model needs to adapt and evolve, you know, and I think you look at Warner Brothers Discovery and how they've evolved. You got to learn. You got to try and make it better in the context that you work in. The problem with Eurosport is that you're working in so many different markets in different ways, and that as a result, you know, you need to be a mainline player in Germany and France. You need to be a peripheral player in India. You know, there is plenty of different things that you need to do, and as such, you know, Eurosport was a great business when I got into it, in that they'd already started doing a streaming product in Eurosport Player with their main core content that the Americans could only dream about. You know, that was miles away from working in the US at that point. So loads of positives going in. And I think, you know, when you look at that Paramount acquisition of WBD, I'd hope that Eurosport and TNT is one of the main attractions.
Peter, can I Can I ask a couple of things on that? Because for a lot of people, it's difficult to understand what people are doing now with all these moguls. In this case, it's Ellison at Paramount that's now buying Warner Brothers, and they've made a lot of quite impressive moves into buying sports rights, the UFC, Champions League. Does this model still work? The subscription model, paying huge amounts for sports rights to maybe be a loss leader for something else, maybe on the entertainment side. Have you got clarity on what these people are trying to do, Peter?
I mean, I think it was amusing how you started, Roger, because I remember I've read you recently going, all these people that make announcements about huge success, we won these rights. And of course, the reality is it's a huge success if you won them at the right price.
Yes.
I think that's the sort of first thing that's important on framing rights acquisitions. But do rights acquisitions still serve bigger goals? I think, yes, they do. Again, you look at different markets, different contexts and price of acquisition. But you look at the US and that ability to be a bigger player in the ad sales market, that's clearly driven NFL and NBA deals. You look at people trying to sell bundles of content. Again, bundles works, right? Bundles
definitely, yeah.
In Murdoch's eyes, Murdoch always used to say that sport is the battering ram along with movies that would get you through the door, and then it's up to you what you do when you get there. So sport has a value beyond the straight P&L of a sports right. It's a question of what are you trying to package with it, and does it make sense as a packaged product? Because clearly doing a whole series of lost leaders is not necessarily a good strategy. But if you really understand what you're trying to achieve, then it can do so.
I'm quoting somebody here, I think it's Evan Shapiro. He's got this quote here that I just found really interesting. Over the last 10 years, revenues of all of TV have increased in total just 24%. Over that same decade, fees for sports rights have grown 121%. Sports fees are now what he calls a survivor tax for television businesses, but that very tax might be the very thing killing traditional TV. I had to stop and read that 2 or 3 times. I've always felt that people are overpaying for things, but to call it a survivor tax, I like that, Peter. Does that strike you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's, 7-8 years ago now, I met Rich Grenfell, the analyst, who described media companies as being like penguins huddling together for warmth. And that sort of, I think, really set the tone for the mergers and acquisitions sort of run that we've been on in the last decade. But I think the question then becomes a survivor tax for what, right? Where are you taking it to? Because if you can justify this by saying, I am going to be the dominant player because coming out of the other side, I can see a monetization model or I can see a bigger picture, then it all makes sense. Paying to survive is not necessarily a bad thing as long as you know where you're going to and as long as those costs are not too prohibitive. The danger of a survivor tax is you're just surviving on the basis that something good will happen. And in that case, then it becomes a slightly stranger play.
Where do you think they're going to, Peter? Are they just trying to get back to the past, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, right? Because consumption is still really strong. Brands are still really strong to drive consumption, but maybe they're different brands than the ones they used to be. You look at, I'd even use Sky, right? And who's the biggest streaming business in the UK? It's Sky, because now has worked well for them. So maybe there's a sense that you can come out the other side, but with a very different type of business. And that's how you would justify, if you wanted to justify, things like the long-term NBA deals, where you think, okay, those deals as TV deals under the current market economics, you'd question a little bit in terms of the increases involved. But if you genuinely believe that whatever the future of media consumption is, there's still a strong business model there, that prime rights will drive that, and that you will test and learn and find the right route, then you're betting on something that you believe in as a future strategy. That's tough, right? And it involves vision. And, you led off, Roger, with talking about the big players, the big moguls. You have to be brave to make those sort of decisions when the unit economics you see around you don't necessarily justify those sort of decisions.
Is it brave, Peter, or is it part of a bigger game now that media and politics are so linked that you can actually lose money on the media side, but if you've got the ear of the right people, it's all going to come round in another way, in a different deal. I try and stop myself getting too obsessed by that, but I even see now Rupert Murdoch trying to block the NFL going to a streamer because he's got the rights on terrestrial there. Mark's right. What is the end game here? Is it power, or is it a P&L account that works?
Yeah, because power clearly works, right? Because power means you can unlock other things. Doesn't mean that you will definitely unlock those other things, but you might believe that will lock. You look at the growth of franchise payments for teams and leagues. It's allowing you into an elite club that maybe the actual fee for the franchise doesn't necessarily justify. So there can be other ways of justifying spending on media content because it buys you a seat at a bigger table. Clearly, that only works for really premium content. We're not talking about buying a New York Marathon here. But certainly bigger deals open up bigger doors. And, without wanting to sound ridiculously optimistic, there is certainly a sense of we want to be there at the table when the things change and go to their next step. You look at people like Fox and ESPN in their international strategies, I see it coming back. You look at what Fox is doing in Latin America at the moment, where even with the Saudi League, we did a pan-Latin American deal for Fox Sports. That would be unthinkable a couple of years ago. They sort of retreated back, partly for the Disney deal reasons, but now they are opening up again. They're very strong in Mexico. They're looking at other markets. Sometimes organizations sort of go in with the tide and go back out with the tide. Fox and ESPN seem to be looking in other territories at the moment. And while there are cuts in terms of manpower and cuts in some of the things they do, you can also see expansionist thinking there as well.
Is that just the old playbook of rolling out what America does to the rest of the world and hoping they'll catch on to American entertainment habits, which we've seen for the last 30 years? It's just got a one more push in it? Or do you think that in order to make money out of these TV deals, these media companies need to basically get nearer to the sports business that isn't just sufficient to be showing these programs for a subscription or for advertising, but actually you want to get nearer to that fan affinity relationship, and that actually brings you head on in conflict or raises an issue about media company versus sport. Which are you? And if the end road of being in media is to own the sport, because you said John Malone got sport, well, his acolyte Zaslav bought a sports channel. John Malone went and bought the sports competition, and now he's bought two. So is that where media moguls go? Is don't buy the sports rights, buy the sport?
I can certainly see the attraction of it, and disintermediating, if that's the right word, is always a good idea. I can see that idea of, can I buy into the ownership of a sport, which is rare in a world of federations. But gradually those opportunities seem to be emerging more and more. And you see the number of startup leagues and organizations that believe that dream that we can own the sport or own the competition. There's certainly no shortage of startups in that area and people trying to do that sort of decision. But F1 is a pretty rare example. And again, you've still got an FII approval and everything. But you can see what they've done with F1 and MotoGP, shows a belief of going in and taking a worldwide IP and trying to monetize it in different ways.
Roger mentioned Murdoch as the man who always got sports. Sports is the battering ram. As you say, he's sort of retreated a bit and then come back again. And also thinks that some sports have too much power, like the NFL. So he wants some of that cut back. Is he the media mogul who really understands sport the best, do you think, in terms of its usefulness? And also what happens when he finally passes on? Do we have anybody else who could take up the mantle of Rupert Murdoch as the man who really understands sport?
I mean, what he did is remarkable, right? When you look at like the timing of his sales as well, because as PAF have pointed out recently, it's not about what you buy, it's about when you sell. And the sale of Sky, the sale of that Fox business to Disney was certainly sales at the top of the market. So I love the fact that, when you own these big prestige rights, one of the key questions is, when do you go out? When do you believe that it's overvalued and you can come on the back of it? So what Murdoch did there was clearly remarkable. I think now we're entering into the sort of Ellison sphere where you look at what he's doing with Paramount around the world. You look at what he's done with Sale GP. He's clearly now making big bets as well. And that's a really interesting story to watch over the next sort of decade, maybe.
So you think the Ellisons might be the inheritors to the Murdochs, and the base that the fathers and sons get on better, maybe? I don't know what the trick is.
Yes.
Let's turn to the third mogul.
Well, let's see what comes. I mean, again, those bets are in that early stages, right? And Paramount Plus is, something that we've got used to in the US for the last few years, but the international moves that they're making now are considerable. And they're sizable money. And whether it be the rights they just bought in Europe or the rights they're buying in South America, they're definitely becoming a worldwide sports player. Taking over TNT in the UK, TNT in the US, Eurosport in Europe is all part of that same story, you'd hope, as they bring those sort of assets together. And that's a phenomenal size of story to be looking at. And, it's a great little case for us to focus on for the next few years.
Absolutely, of course.
For
they
sure.
need to repay their debt. So as Mr. Murdoch found out when his future relied upon convincing a handful of Midwest banks that he was a good asset to keep investing in, you have to keep them happy too. And I guess that may be the focus in the next few years, as well as the strategy.
Let's go on to what I think is the subject of the industry these days, which is the platforms, and the mogul we're talking about specifically with Peter is Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, now called Meta. You had a very important role there, Peter. I think you've spoken a lot in the past about whether it was the role you thought you were going into or not going into. My opening gambit question on this, to get the ball rolling on this, did Facebook ever take sports seriously? Should it take sports seriously?
I think, first of all, it's a very serious organization. It's a data-driven organization. And giving credit in the right place. Dan Reed convinced them to make some bets on sport, which were not in its nature. And Dan said, look, it's worth a try. And it's in the nature of Meta that it's a test and learn business. So they went out and they tested on sport. But I think they learned some things that made it very difficult for them to win at sport. And notably, it was the ad sales model, the fact that programmatic ad sales is at the core of Meta, and programmatic ad sales doesn't really work for premium sport. So something needs to change. And what I love to say about that Meta period was actually one of the great success stories now came out of what we did, which was what we did in Latin America, where Dan and I hired a guy called Leo Lenz Cesar, who was, lovely guy, brilliant track record, built up EI Sports that, EI became the sort of the usurper sports business in Brazil, and they sold TNT. So he had a really deep knowledge of that market. with the team that he built around him at EI and the founders that they had together. And basically, that group is now at the core of Kaze TV, and the learning of Kaze TV and what they're doing with the streaming business is basically very similar to what we sort of slightly against the plan of Meta did with the Champions League in South America, where we said we need to sell that not programmatically, but as content. So you could, for the first time on Meta, Heineken could do a deal where they would appear on Champions League content, as opposed to a deal where they would find 15 to 30-year-olds in Brazil who liked football. So we could sell it to premium. And the team in South America, the ad sales team there, bought into that as a trial. Meta as a whole did not like that trial, but it allowed that business to work and for us to make the most of the Champions League rights we had. The same principle of selling content on that way with a live free-to-air stream and sponsors attached into it is absolutely at the heart of what Kaze TV do. And Kaze TV is an unbelievable story. I mean, because it's in Brazil and now it's just launching in Portugal, I don't think it gets the attention that the worldwide sports media really should have on it, because it's now taken the premium rights, FIFA rights, IOC rights, La Liga rights. I saw this week they're in discussions on the Premier League. It's the top of the business that is now free to air and streaming in Brazil. And if you look at the YouTube numbers, I think out of the top 18 live streams on YouTube, I'll get that wrong, 11 of the top 16, I've got it written down, but I can't read my writing. 11 of the top 16 streams in YouTube's history are Kaze TV broadcasts. That's an amazing story to come out of Brazil and talking about rights that are fundamentally Brazil-only rights. So it shows there's a model there. And now Kaze TV are taking that on and launching in Portugal, and they've clearly tied up, as they announced this week, with Ronaldo as one of the ways of putting that stream out there. This is a really interesting experiment to see if
are you
can
saying that their business model is different in the sense that they're selling their own inventory and bringing in their own sponsors, and that's how they're getting premium content? So they're on YouTube, but they're actually monetizing their own content rather than doing a revenue share of YouTube. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah. Effectively, they're buying out the YouTube part of the share and taking it over. But they're doing so with an industrial ad sales team, which is basically what they did when it was a sports channel as EI. So they've learned from their sports channel business about how to sell and what works with sports fans and what works with sports rights holders, and they're putting it into a YouTube model. Roger, you're always very bullish on the power of YouTube, and so am I. But the issue has always been, yeah, great, we get the reach, we get these huge eyeball numbers, but where's the money? And somehow
Absolutely.
Kaze TV putting that together.
Do you think YouTube will be happy with that? I mean, they may be happy with that as an exception, i.e. there's a service, it builds a lot of traffic, it sells its own advertising, but they don't want a lot of the biggest assets on their platform to suddenly start selling their own advertising, because that starts to unwind the model.
One of the truths, it's a good question, Mark, because one of the truths about working with the social media platforms is building a business on a social media platform that could change its rules at any time is fundamentally a risky area. But at the moment, it's clearly working for YouTube because they're getting premium content on. You're building up that sports streaming habit in a way that a Brazilian YouTube office probably wouldn't have the budget to go and do it itself. And, that was the learning with Meta, right? In that, one of the things that used to make me laugh was that you'd have people going, but Meta have got loads of money, they can buy the sports rights. It's like, well, they could, but why would they want to, right? And this has brought in a group of sports experts into a market, a market where pay TV has not been fantastically successful. They saw the opportunity, and they have taken that opportunity. And, again, one of the themes of the stuff that I talk about a lot is you find it difficult to make rules for worldwide because some markets are really competitive and some markets are not. And if you're smart, you launch at that point when there's not competition there, and it works, and that's what we did when we launched the sports channel in India back in 2002 around the Soccer World Cup. You just had a moment where it worked. These guys have found a moment, it's worked. Now the question where, I think you're right, Mark, the jury's out is, can it scale? Can it keep going? Can it get bigger? But the evidence of the last few years has been, a real phenomena.
Can we push on this subject? Because it's not just the sports themselves, but increasingly we're seeing the mainstream broadcasters saying YouTube is where the audience is. We can't afford to be off it. We're going to have content for... But does that really work? Given the economics on YouTube, given they control the platform, they control the algorithm, they can do the equivalent of shifting your position on the EPG from number 1 to 221 in a second, and you won't even know it until you see the traffic's gone down. They also like to share revenue. They may allow you to sell some inventory, but they're going to want their slice of the pie. So if consumption is going onto these platforms, YouTube, Meta, TikTok, etc., isn't the problem that apart from exceptions, which you've named, there's not going to be enough money in it? And if there is enough money in it, these platforms are going to get it. They're going to say, thank you for the consultancy. We'll do it instead. And that really what lies at the heart of this problem is one, the yield on viewership on these platforms and how high it is. And secondly, competition, that there isn't enough competition in these platforms to get them to compete with each other for the best content. They'll carry you, they'll take a share of your revenue. If you get too greedy, they'll take a greater share of your revenue. And in the end, you don't have much choice because that's the platform you have to be on. The only choice is to build your own ecosystem on the back of it and take people away from these platforms eventually and have your own outlet and be your own media distribution system, which takes you back to being an old-fashioned media company. So is this all illusory? The great YouTube, social media traffic boom for sports, yes, it's great. It's great for reach. It was great for promotional purposes. It may be, in some cases, great for the economics of some businesses around the world. But in the end, unless there's competition between these platforms, you're never really going to get rich off them. Because as soon as it's a big prize, they're going to take it away from you.
The key line here is if you're good and you look at the changes and you ride the changes, then you can make these things work. What's very clear is that it's complicated and it changes all the time. And that's one of the reasons the sports industry doesn't like it, because you've got to make a lot more effort than sit there and receive a TV rights check. Roger, you've talked about Joe Redfern and the work that her and Paolo Marinari and people like that have done. What they're great at is seeing the change, being ahead of the change, giving good advice of how you can make the most of it. But I don't look at the social platforms as being competition for content. I see them more like telcos, where they're all essentially offering the same service, which is a way of getting your content out there. But the deal with the telco is permanently changing. The story is changing. Telcos have to win by, offering reliability, but also offering price packaging that brings people with them. So it's not necessarily about the content. The content could be everywhere. And in many ways, I think the content should be everywhere. It's more about riding the changes of those economic models to create a successful story. And it's clearly not just YouTube, right? It's clearly working on Reddit and Discord and Instagram and TikTok. You've got to be in multiple places. There is no one easy solution now. And then you've got to do so with a purpose that is a financial purpose. The thing that probably annoys me more than anything else about social is like, we got X amount of views and we got, Y amount of engagement. And it's like, and why? Where's it taking people to?
Peter, I think there's so much in the last 5-10 minutes. I put a team together with Joe and Paula and we did some work for various clients in this. So I think I've got a pretty sophisticated view of what you're talking about there. There's a couple of things that you mentioned in the last 10 minutes. One, the programmatic way of selling advertising, where if sport wants to do it on free-to-air, and we're calling YouTube free-to-air these days, you have to do it with what you called an industrial sales team. And YouTube don't have that. Now, they may work to get it. They may, in some ways, use somebody else to sell it for them. I may be wrong here, but maybe they use the Sky UK sales force for some things. I'm not sure. But what the point I'm making here is that, shoot me down here, because I'm taking the devil's advocate side of this. Nobody's been more bullish on where YouTube trends were going in the last 2 years than me, but I'm taking the devil's advocate side of this. There's no money, real money, that you can make on YouTube because the ads are just said what they are. Maybe you could get the membership scheme going, and there's some good examples of that, and that could replace your internal owned and operated thing. Maybes, ifs. How the hell does that work in an industry that can't get out of bed in the morning if it hasn't got safe, secure, major upfront money? How the hell does that work, Peter?
First of all, we just talked through Kaze TV. They clearly offer big guarantees to major leagues against content. That's like one part of the story, right? That's a rare example at the moment, but it proves that there are test cases like that. The second bit of it is that the traditional media money is still there. The issue is how you use that media money, give them a business model that works for them, but also you have enough space to test and learn with your own content on all these different platforms so you can see where it's going. And it might not be direct monetization. It might not be, here's the check that comes at the end of the month and the check is the same, because it will go up and down. It might be about what we used to call at Meta commerce and conversion, where, some really impressive people at Meta would go to sports organizations and say, look, you've got all this follower count, you've got these views, you've got this engagement. This is how you use it to drive direct sales of things that you have, whether it be ticketing or merchandises or experiences or whatever. But what you clearly need is a philosophy that says, I'm doing this for a financial purpose. One of the things that I've done you laughed at the start about this long list of people that I sort of work with. One of the things I sort of insist with all of them is when they give me that digital sort of, PowerPoint that says, we've reached massive views, our growth is X. I'm like, okay, what's the revenue? What have you achieved with that? And that's something that, again, you learn this through messing up yourself. I remember at Eurosport, we were massively proud of some stuff we did with Eric Cantona, where he created these beautiful bits of video. A guy called Arno Seymour ran it. And it was really engaging content. And one of the guys from the States, Mike Lang, said, okay, but where are you taking people to? It's brilliant for Eurosport brand recognition. What are you doing with this content? And it was a really fair point. And it totally deflated my sort of bullishness about how great this content was. But he was right. And you learn from these people that test and learn and point you in the direction of how do you make this into a business.
Peter, that's so profound what you said there. And actually, I think we're agreeing, one could take, and Joe and Paolo would do this every day, that's their day job. One could take all these great news stories, the Bundesliga with Goldbridge, Kaze TV, all the things that are happening now. And at the same time, you could turn around and say, you know why they're doing that? Because there's no market for overseas rights anymore. And they got pushed into a corner and they're making, what's that phrase? A purse out of a pig's ear. If I wanted to argue the other side of it, Peter, I could.
Yeah, no, you could. And, sometimes adversity brings a sort of fresh approach, right? Because you've got to find a solution. And relying on the old model clearly isn't the solution, because you will just slide away into the darkness. We did a deal in France as the Saudi League with an influencer called Zach Nani. And he pitched to us, to be fair, through IMG. And we were like, we don't know who this guy is, right? And he pitches, and he's really impressive on the pitch. And he clearly cared about the content, and he knows what he's talking about on the Saudi League. And frankly, our rights offers in France were not great. And we took the gamble. We went with him. It has worked better than we could have imagined. And both in terms of revenue and in terms of audience. Our audience is way better than it used to be on Canal Plus, where, clearly it wasn't a priority for them. But this guy is authentic. He's got the plus of why Goldbridge works about Man United, in that as a Man United fan that he cares. Whether that scales to non-Man United content, I think is questionable. But with this guy, he cares. He's making the story well. We've now given him French language rights in Belgium and Canada as well, and allowed him to have a bigger footprint. But, in adversity, you come up with good solutions. And the fact that maybe you wouldn't have come up with those good solutions without the adversity is also possibly true. But if you find them, then great. And then it's a test and learn. And then you think, okay, where can I do the same again?
Do you think there's a danger in this for sport? That these things work, the influencers, etc., they work, they bring audiences in. But in the old, sports own the live feed. They own the access to the stadium. They own the live feed. They own the pitches. They don't own the conversation around the sport. And if the industry of conversation around the sport, with new generations not being as interested in watching the whole live game, wanting to see clips, want to talk about it amongst their friends, if that's where all the value goes, it's a long way away from the sport. They're going to have to do a lot of work so you get companies like the Overlap and Gohang are now having significant valuations and being bought and sold, and they're just talking about sport. I know Gohang is going to have some clips going forward, and is basically trying to replace Match of the Day, I guess, for all sorts of reasons, some personal, I would guess. But isn't there a danger for sport that you don't own the conversation, you just own the rights? And in some ways, sports are paying the price for not being great facilitators of the conversation. In fact, when they get involved in the conversation, that's when fans switch off, because it's the official voice of the sport or the official voice of the club. There's a danger for sports. They will lose control of the model. At least media companies paid them a check. Now they're not getting a check and they're not actually getting any control, and they're also not getting the data necessarily, because you talked about your e-commerce team at Facebook helping these people think about how they can monetize it. But the data kind of stayed within Facebook, right? We'd help you get to these people, but we ain't going to tell you who they are. You're going to have to find out for yourself if you want to. So aren't you losing control of those elements which might be the future business model for sport? And isn't that quite dangerous for sports?
It is dangerous, but the genie is out of the bottle. Fans are fans 24/7
Yes, it is.
On multiple platforms. You can't say, wait for Tuesday night and the one game that we select for you that you will watch. Those days have gone. So you've got to find a way of, as you said, Mark, monetizing the conversation and making a fan who identifies with your athlete, your team, your brand, someone who consumes in a much wider sense than just paying for that live stream of one game. One of the things that I saw, it's pretty rare, Roger, that I've sneaked Derby County into a conversation, but one of the sponsors there is Fan Hub, and they've created a fan loyalty system where you're earning points that you spend in the ground, but you're earning them in the whole sort of community of Derby, and you do it because you badge yourself as a Derby fan. So you might go to a certain restaurant because it's their partner restaurant, or a petrol station or whatever. And little model, not a massive money, I'll give you. But I think that's the way you've got to think is, how do you be at the center of someone's life in a way that brings financial benefit back to a sports organization? One of the firms that I work with that's clearly really different to the others is professional triathlon, for example, where the advantage of professional triathlon is if you're a triathlete all the time, right? The amount of training it's not an incidental part of your life. And the value of the PTO and what we've been able to build up there is very much about that idea that, not ripping off the community, but bringing the community so when they do spend, they're spending on something that goes back into the sport. So you become part of their travel, you become part of their equipment buys, you become part of a conversation that has multiple financial elements to it. And I really like it as a concept because, you know, if you force yourself to think in that wider way, then going back to Roger's lost leader comment from earlier, you know, the media stream is there and it helps you care more, but it's not necessarily central to the monetization.
And is there a problem then, bringing Derby County into the conversation twice? That there's a club versus league issue. Some of the power of the leagues is because they sell the media rights. Or they say in Europe they sell all the media rights basically, and in the US there's a bit of a division. But their power comes from sell the media rights. You divide the income up. That's why the league has power. It has the money. If the way to monetize media is to monetize the conversation with fans and to monetize that relationship, that kind of shifts back to the club. Isn't that going to cause some issues between league and club? Because whose fan are they? They're the club's fan, they're not the league's fan.
And I think increasingly they're the individual's fan as well. You know, that's the other part of this story, right? It's not even just leagues and teams now. You know, we see with the Ronaldo phenomenon, you know, as we sort of moved around Europe, every training ground that my kid would go and play soccer in had the latest variety of a Ronaldo shirt, no matter where he is. You know, they were Ronaldo fans. They want Juve or Man U or Al Nassr fans. So yes, that sort of dynamic is clearly changing all the time, and it's why, you know, a lot of the experimentation comes from people that haven't got those big league to media company big check deals, because you're forced to think in a different way.
I want to say a little bit to PTO here, because it is a bit of a poster child of, I think, where I think almost all sport, apart from the really top premium ones, is going to end up. A de-weighting of the media check and some kind of new model around community. I don't think you can ever own or monetize fan conversations. You've mentioned some practical reasons for that. I just think it's a little bit like trying to copyright ideas. I just don't think you can monetize conversations. And I wouldn't be building a business on that. The business I like for the PTO and why, for full disclosure, I'm an investor, is that it sits on its own without any media bucks. And if you do what you're going to do, and all the LinkedIn capturing the spend of that community, then you can use YouTube and all these other things for the wonderful awareness and connection, community and loyalty and conversation. But it's marketing add-on. I guess what I'm saying is, the more I look at something like the PTO and feel good about that, the less I feel confident that so many sports today that are absolutely centered around a media check, I'm not bullish about their future, because they ain't going to get a media check if they're not the NFL or the EPL or something like that. That's where I want to ask you, Peter and Mark. I mean, you both are, I think, more optimistic than me on this thing, but I cannot get away from the fact that sport needs that upfront check. And the media people, apart from very few exceptions, they ain't going to give it. And I say, when does that car hit the wall?
Go on, Mark, that's too difficult. You can answer it first.
Well, you're right in general, Roger, that for many smaller sports, the media check is not the answer. I think they're already seeing that. They're going to have to build a business in a different way. They're going to have to go back to, we talked about the inversion. We talked before about the music industry used to be, the tour was to promote and you sold the CDs. Now the CDs are promotional and the music's promotional.
Exactly.
And the money's
Great
in the
point.
tour. So you're going to build a bigger stadium. You're going to make the event bigger. You're going to have direct commerce relationships with your fans, etc. And media is going to be an afterthought. In fact, it's a way to build reach and get data. That's the main function of your media distribution strategy. So for lots of sports, that's going to change the business plan. You're right that for the bigger sports, there still is a check. They're the big event. They won't bring people to what will be what are channels or whatever they are in the future, services or apps. But there's going to be a huge polarization. Of course, there is, and I think that's what we're going through now. I don't think people looking at business plans, you're an investor and see a large media number for a new event, are going to believe it. And often the business plan has a small media number in cycle 1 and a much bigger number in cycle 2, which is the old trick. And of course, that isn't what happens. So you've got to rethink the business from ground up. And I think what's the interesting area, because there's sports I think will definitely fit into the media isn't the answer anymore, or maybe never was, and some sports where media still can be. It's the area between that. Largest sports where the media number is still pretty important. Which way do they go? And I think they're the ones facing the most difficult decision. Do they pursue the hope the media number might go up? They might go from the 8th ranked sporting event in the country to the 4th ranked sporting event and join the ones that do get in the media check? Or do they actually say, we're just a big version of these newer sports and we're going to have to reinvent that relationship completely? And I think they faced the biggest issues. And if you look at the NBA Europe's plan, that is an attempt to become another big sport. It's basically we want to become the 2nd or 3rd biggest event in lots of European countries because there's no clear 2nd or 3rd event, unlike in the UK where there's a kind of bigger hierarchy. And that may work, but they're trying to break through to being one of those bigger sports. But what do you do with your rugby? Are you a bigger sport or club rugby? Or are you a smaller sport? Do you reinvent your business model to be less about media rights, or do you pursue the dream that the media rights will keep on going up? That's a big issue for those sports, I think.
I think that the NBA Europe example is really interesting, right? Because the EuroLeague does have some value. It delivers good numbers, particularly in markets like Greece and Turkey and Spain. But what the NBA have done that is the deal maker here is the franchise fee. And I know they haven't got them yet, but they're asking for huge franchise fees. But that sort of, again, is rethinking a model of European basketball, maybe trying to put an American frame on it. But if they get that sort of franchise fee model and the quality of investors that they're talking to, then that potentially changes basketball because it isn't about the media rights deal. If you were going into European basketball now saying, I'm investing because of the quality of the media market, you're making the wrong bet fundamentally, for most markets, particularly the UK. But maybe if you can open up a franchise model, have a large injection of cash because of the franchise model, then that allows you to market strongly from day one. And we go again. I thought really interesting that there's been this conversation about women's soccer in the UK about maybe that should be a franchise model and not a promotion relegation league model. Again, you've got people wanting to make the emotional spend, have an ownership position. Maybe that's what unlocks a different revenue line rather than seeing it as a traditional, the media number is going to keep going up. It has gone up in the last couple of years, but isn't necessarily going to keep increasing at the same rate.
In the end, the franchise business model and the league business model are connected. The latest discussions, which may or may not be true, that the NBA has basically said we're going to guarantee each of the franchises a certain income from the central league pot, and we'll go off and take the risk of selling the media rights and the combined rights. There's still, to make the numbers add up, that still has to be underpinned by the league earning decent amounts of media revenue at some point, in which case they've got the money to pay the franchises a fee, which then makes the franchises worthwhile. So I think it's an interesting financial kind of trick where you get the franchises to pay the money, which you then use to build the league, which then gets the media rights. It's an interesting way of raising finance from your own members. But it doesn't get you away from the fact if the media number doesn't come up to what you expect, then the franchisees are going to be disappointed with the money they've spent and the whole thing starts to go back.
It's fascinating the difference between that model and what Tom Harrison did so well with the 100, where basically he sold the 100 as a concept, but he sold it as part of the bigger media package. So he sold his test rights and ODI rights and his 100 rights to Sky. And then they agreed a value within that package that gave the 100 a starting point. Whereas the NBA has just done these 10-year deals, including large chunks of Europe, for its core content, when you could maybe think, well, hang on, why didn't you wait to do those deals with the European NBA as part of them? And then you're not starting from nil.
Exactly. You guys brought this up. I wasn't going to mention it, but you brought basketball in. This is a quote from Puck, the media publication. NBA's tankonomics, which means teams not trying a leg in plain man's English. Injuries, top players not playing, is making the NBA regular season veering into something like spring training territory, just as the league is trying to justify its multi-billion-dollar value to its media partners. That's hard to read. You know, like you've got to read things like this, and it can't just be me that thinks this. And you say, we've getting something wrong here. You know, there's too many people that think this train can only go in one direction and can only get faster. Where you've got all these things all around, and that's one of the things that worries me. That this continual idea that comes from many of my colleagues in the finance industry that call sport an asset class, and all of those brochures are based around media rights going up and to the right, and it's just not the case. It's just not the case. Even the NBA regular season, I would argue, Peter, now is no longer premium rights. Playoffs are, but the regular season isn't. Tell me I'm becoming an old curmudgeon. Tell me I've got something wrong here.
You're becoming an old curmudgeon, Roger, but that wasn't news. I think, you know, there are clearly challenges, I would say, about the NBA, right? And you know, I like poking fun, particularly at large sports organizations, about not being forward-thinking. NBA is always the one that leads the way, right? And particularly when you look about digital and social content and the way that they, you know, bought into startup companies, gave them equity and see a rise. You know, what they do with Greenfly that I see all the time in my Greenfly hound is fantastic. You know, they use their players really well. And, you know, it sort of makes me laugh when I'm sat in San Francisco most of the time and the Warriors are our local team, and I listen to the talk radio station that is in San Francisco, and it's person after person grumbling about how bad it is and how there's nothing left this season, and that, you know, the playoffs were sort of a bridge too far for them. And yet the prices of the tickets is still unbelievable. You know, there's an economy there that defies the tanking belief because people are still paying, and it's not like you can rely on that. So, you know, watch and learn with the NBA. I think the good thing about them as an organization is that there is a problem. They're clearly thinking about the problem. They'll try and create a way out of the problem. But regular season games in American sport, other than the NFL, which clearly is just a different monster, you know, it is an issue. But, you know, America is just such an enormous market that, and the quality of the ownerships, the amount of money they raise on ticket sales and F&B and all the rest of it, that's an incredible vehicle that is difficult to push out.
I mean, I think the regular season versus playoffs is a kind of subset of the tendency that sport always wants to increase output, thinking that they're not realizing the diminishing returns. And if you do it too much, you denude one.
Absolutely agree, Mark. I mean, you've seen it all the time, right? Yeah. You talk to a league and you're like, how are we going to get the number up? And they're like, we'll give them more games. And it's like, no, wrong answer.
Doesn't tend to please the players very much, especially if it's physically demanding. Can we go back to these middle sports, which may have to accept the media check is not going to go up, or may even go down, and have to rethink it and come to one of your roles, Peter, which is rugby league. The future for rugby league, both in this country, the UK, my country, but also globally. Where do you think, without portraying any sort of things that you can't say, where do you think that really goes? Because I think it's one of the sports that is kind of at the level where obviously their media check did go down, and they're having to readjust their expectations. But also they have a very loyal fan base, a very, very loyal fan base, in fact, much to the disappointment of rugby union, which has tried to grow its fan base in the north of England and hasn't been that successful. So where do you think they go from your experience? How do they respond to this kind of what's called the K curve, or whatever it's called? Some sports go up and a lot go down.
Yeah, I'd say rugby league is definitely going up. And, we're in the middle of a negotiation at the moment, but I say with absolute confidence we're on our way up, and hopefully quite sizably up. And it's also partly because, you sort of, I would prime it as a primary sport. It is a dominant sport in a big chunk of the country. The sport in Australia is going through the roof. I mean, the numbers there are staggering. It's about to do a new media deal there that, will break all records. You've got a load of very positive stories there. And also you've got individual club owners that are clearly innovators and impressive. A lot of times when people look at something like Major League Soccer, for example, and they're like, it's not that great. And you think, yeah, okay, but look at the quality of the owners. They've taken long-term bets. Something will keep moving here. You look in rugby league, the owners like Simon Moran, who just did the Oasis promotion, incredibly impressive individual owner of Warrington. Mike Danson, Global Data at Wigan. You look at what the guys at Wakefield and Hull KR in particular and Lee have done, where they've taken old clubs that were on the way down and suddenly there's life and energy there. You look at the gate figures for rugby league, I mean, they're just booming. We just
What do you think, do you think, because the NRL obviously is bigger than UK rugby league, do you think there's much more, they could do more to play each other more often? And obviously there's discussions about the NRL becoming a shareholder in rugby league in the UK. Do you think that's the future? Because in some ways I think we have a single competition between the North and South every year, but just a top club, which unfortunately Australians tend to win more often than not. Do you think
I'd like
there's
to
a
point
future in
out
that?
the World Club Challenge, we've won the last 3, but anyway.
There you go. That's how much I know about rugby league.
But, there's definitely more we could do with a dusting of international glamour on it. The game that we play in Vegas every year started off with the Australians playing a series of games in Vegas, and now the British teams play there every year. And we got like another 50,000 crowd in the Legion in Las Vegas to watch rugby league this year. Brilliant example, credit to the Australians, Peter Vlandis, Andrew Abdu set it off, and it clearly was a lost leader to start with, but now is standalone profitable. So, we can think of good ideas. We've got games going to Paris again shortly. Wigan are playing in Paris against Catalan. There are strong promotional heads in the sport. Joe Steele, who was the guy behind the 100 marketing, now works in rugby league. He's been a great acquisition for the sport. So again, I'm not ignoring the overall trends and the dynamics, but good people and good ideas can change your economics.
Let's end with a couple of things that are still in my wheelhouse a little bit. Well, these are things that you and I have exchanged over these weeks, Peter. EPL media rights, IPL, forgive it, in Italy it's the different pronunciation. IPL media rights set to plateau at 5.4 billion in next cycle. Reports estimate 13% dip in pre-match value amid lack of competitive tension. And I see that. I don't follow that, so I'm not an expert, but I see that at the same time. I see FIFA not being able to get their rights away in India and China. I think those are the two markets. Peter, what's going on? What's going on in that part of the world that I don't know enough about in the media rights?
So I'm in Bangalore today, and I have to say it's a bit of a deja vu feeling, right? Because 2002, I was definitely a factor at IMG, and we drove up all the rights prices in the market to a ridiculous level where cricket was over $1 million a day. And the unthinkable happened that ESPN and Star, Fox and Disney merged and created a joint venture channel because they were going to collapse the media values and dominate the market. So a guy called Chris McDonald came to see me in Delhi and he said, do you fancy starting a new sports channel while the prices are down? And we bought the World Cup rights for virtually nothing in 2002, started a channel called 10 Sports. We hovered off a whole load of sports rights, became the #1 channel in India within a couple of years. we were profitable, we sold 8 years later, and we took advantage of that belief that somebody has just captured the market, therefore all the prices are going to fall. So someone else came in and bought. And I'd say, going back to Cazé TV, that's what they did in Brazil, right? Rights had collapsed. They stepped in, took advantage of the moment. India is a really, I could do more than one podcast about India, and probably better if you had real experts on as well. But the IPL, I was involved with a couple of the bidders for the franchises, and the fundamental sort of position, I think, of everybody was, yeah, okay, maybe next time round it is flat, but long term, there's a whole load of untold value there. The challenge is IPL's position in the calendar, because you can expand the IPL, you can expand its income, but there's a collapse everywhere else, right? Because IPL could take a much bigger window of the cricket calendar every year, but the rest of the cricket constituents don't necessarily benefit from that. So that's part of the challenge, is can they keep expanding? To Mark your point, it's not always more games and more value, but in Indian cricket, IPL cricket is still fundamentally an advertising-driven value. And there appears to be plenty more advertisers that want to come in. So, more games probably is more value here, maybe not proportionally, but in total. So I'm pretty bullish on IPL. I still think there's a long way to go. There's a relatively small amount of franchises as well. So you can certainly see franchise growth coming. So if people buy in, they're possibly buying in on the belief that more cities, more billionaires are going to buy in and want teams in their city. So you see growth in that way as well.
And FIFA? Why can't FIFA get these deals away?
I think they've got a deal done in China now, right? So it's just India left standing. Good question. I think actually football in India is really big. I helped start the National Soccer League here, which hasn't been a massive success, but I like starting it anyway. And I did so because there are huge pockets of India where they do really care about football, noticeably Bengal and Goa and Kerala historically, but also now you see, the football academies growing in Mumbai and in Delhi. It's there at a decent level across the country. Certainly the price is falling because of Jio's domination of the market at the moment, but also there's realities to it in terms of the games are through the night. This is still an ad sales driven market. And at this point, it's clearly a buyer's market, not a seller's market, because, FIFA need to get the game out here. I still think a deal could easily get done, but you've also got options like FIFA Plus or doing a deal.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? Is that not what FIFA Plus is meant to be about? What all of these D2C things are meant to be about? Don't piss me around or I'll do it myself. Well, here's the perfect example for FIFA. And what do? They cave. What is the point of FIFA Plus, Peter? What is the point of it?
I think what FIFA Plus has done really well is be a platform for a load of content that couldn't get exposure, particularly opening up things like data deals for federations, and that's not necessarily at the top end of the market, but you've got organizations like Dutch League, German FA, the big federations. There's often some content on FIFA Plus. I don't think it's really being used as optionality by FIFA's TV sales division yet, but maybe it could be, and maybe it will be. And also, it's a pretty rare position for them to be in, right? In that normally, I always joke, the person selling the Champions League or FIFA is like, it's like, come on in, have my free food. Let me, everyone wants to be nice to them. It's pretty rare for FIFA to have a market where they're like, okay, this is a struggle. So, it would involve a different way of thinking.
Okay, Peter, we've run you around the course. We didn't even get on to the various sports tech things you do. Maybe that's for another conversation, and not much about the Saudi Pro League. But so there's plenty for part two. Maybe we have to arrange one. But that's been great. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and responding to our questions with the good humour that you've shown.
Oh, look, it's. I listened to the first show, thought it was really interesting. I like the idea that, people are discussing ideas, because, we do need to change. The market is changing all the time. And thankfully, that's why people need consultants. So good for all three of us.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. Great to have you on board, Mark. I'd like to thank the people that make this possible, which is 54. And you can follow us at all the usual places. Thanks to all the listeners. Take care.